The December wind off Lake Michigan doesn't just cut through you, it finds every gap in your coat, every crack in your resolve, and reminds you exactly how small a man can feel standing on the sidewalk outside a restaurant he owns, but has never once walked into as himself. I stood there that Tuesday evening in a canvas work jacket, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $32, with a fraying collar and a left pocket that had been stitched back on twice. My name is Gerald Marsh. I am 63 years old. And the man sitting inside that restaurant, waiting for me at a corner table, had been married to my daughter for 4 years without ever once asking where I actually went every morning. His name was Derek Calloway. He was the chief executive officer of Marsh Medical Holdings, a regional healthcare network spanning 11 hospitals across the Midwest, built from a single urgent care clinic I opened in 1987 with a second mortgage on a house I could barely afford. Derek did not know I had built it. He did not know my name was on the founding documents, held behind a family trust called Lakeshore Capital Partners. He knew me only as Claire's father, the quiet one, the widower who drove an 11-year-old Buick and brought store-brand coffee cake to Sunday dinners. I pulled open the door and let the warm air of the restaurant fold over me. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I was not there that night to catch Derek doing anything wrong. I was there because my daughter had called me 3 days earlier, crying in a way I had not heard since she was 9 years old, and her mother was in the ICU after the accident. Claire had called me at 6 in the morning, and she had said, "Dad, I think I made a mistake." And then she had caught herself and said, "No, never mind, I'm fine, forget I called." And she had hung up. A man who has raised a child alone for 22 years does not forget a call like that. Derek was already seated when I arrived. He was wearing a charcoal suit that I later learned cost more than $4,000. He had ordered a bottle of wine before I sat down, which he would not offer to pay for. He stood when he saw me approach, I will give him that, and he shook my hand with that particular firmness that men perform when they want you to know they consider themselves above you. "Sit down, Gerald," he said. "I already ordered the good stuff." I sat down. I folded my hardware store jacket over the back of my chair. I looked around the restaurant, the warm amber lighting, the white tablecloths, the particular hushed quality of a room where every dish is described in 3 lines of small print, and I felt the familiar, almost affectionate sensation of knowing something no one else in the room knew. I had bought this restaurant 18 months ago as a tax-efficient real estate acquisition. The head chef, a woman named Rosario, sent me a card at Christmas every year. Derek poured the wine without asking if I wanted any, and launched into what I can only describe as a prepared speech. He talked about his vision for where his career was heading. He talked about a performance review he was expecting in February that he said was, quote, basically a formality at this point. He talked about a lake house he and Claire were considering in Wisconsin, a property he described as a reasonable investment for someone at his level. I nodded. I drank the wine, which was excellent. Then he set his glass down, straightened the cuff of his $4,000 jacket, and told me why he had asked me to dinner. He said he thought it was time for Claire to stop working. I kept my face very still. He said that given where things were going professionally for him, it didn't make sense for her to keep at it. He said it would be better for their household, he used the word household, if she focused on being available. He said he needed a partner who could support the life he was building, not someone distracted by a part-time occupational therapy practice. I looked at him across the table. Claire had worked for 7 years to build that practice. She had worked through her mother's death. She had worked through a miscarriage she told me about only in pieces, over months, because she hadn't wanted to worry me. She had built something that was entirely hers, and this man in his $4,000 suit was describing it as a distraction. I picked up my wine glass. I said, "That sounds like a conversation to have with Claire." He smiled the smile of a man who has already had the conversation and considers it settled. He said, "Of course. I just wanted to loop you in." Loop you in, like I was a minor stakeholder in my own daughter's life. I drove home that night in my 11-year-old Buick, and I sat in the driveway for a long time with the engine off. The house was quiet. It is always quiet now. Margaret, my wife, has been gone for 19 years, and I have made my peace with the silence in the way you make peace with something you will never stop missing. But that night the silence felt different. It felt like the space before something moves. I went inside. I made coffee. I called my general counsel, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who has worked with me for 16 years and who answers her phone at 10:30 at night without complaint. I said, "Pat, I need you to pull together everything we have on Derek Calloway's compensation structure, his expense reports, and any capital requests he's filed in the last 18 months. There was a pause on the line. She said, "Gerald, is there something specific I should be looking for?" I said, "I don't know yet. That's what I need to find out. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters." I did not go looking for what I found because of that dinner. The dinner told me something about Derek's character, about the particular, casual way he had with other people's dignity, but it did not make him a criminal. What made him a criminal was what Patricia found when she started pulling the documents. It started with an equipment lease. Marsh Medical Holdings had approved a capital expenditure the previous April, 7 surgical robotics units for 3 of our facilities. A legitimate and necessary upgrade. The total contract value was $4.2 million. The vendor was a company called Centrex Surgical Solutions, which had won the bid over 2 competing firms. What Patricia noticed 3 days into her review was that Centrex Surgical Solutions had been incorporated in Delaware 14 months before the contract was signed. Its registered agent was a law firm in Indianapolis. Its sole operating officer was listed as a man named Thomas Brennan. Thomas Brennan was Derek Calloway's college roommate. I read Patricia's email at 5 in the morning, standing at my kitchen counter in my robe. I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and stood very still for a moment, looking out the window at the dark yard, at the bare branches of the oak tree Margaret had planted the year we moved in, at the particular gray blue of a December sky before sunrise. My daughter had married a man who was stealing from the company her father built. He had no idea those 2 facts were connected. That was the only reason any of it had worked. Let me tell you about Derek Calloway before any of this happened, because you deserve to understand who he is, not just what he did. He came from a good family in Cincinnati. His father was a cardiologist. His mother ran a nonprofit. He had gone to the right schools, gotten the right degrees, said the right things in interviews. He was the kind of man who makes very good first impressions and very gradual second ones. Claire had met him at a professional conference in Atlanta 6 years ago. She had called me afterward, her voice bright in a way it hadn't been in a while, and told me she had met someone who actually listened when she talked. I had wanted that to be true. I had believed it, because she believed it, and because I had learned long ago that some things you choose to believe because the alternative is unbearable. He had interviewed for the CEO position at Marsh Medical Holdings 2 years before the wedding. I had not been in that interview. The board's search committee had run the process, as they were designed to do. My role, by deliberate design, was invisible. The trust structure meant that my name appeared nowhere in the company's public-facing materials. The board knew who I was. My CFO, my general counsel, my chief of staff, they knew. Nobody else did. This was not an accident. I had built it this way intentionally, years ago, after a painful early lesson about what happens to a founder's relationships with employees, with vendors, with family when everyone knows exactly how much you're worth. Claire did not know. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because several people who learn this story ask the same question, and they deserve a real answer. Claire did not know because I had set up the trust and restructured the company 4 years after her mother died, when Claire was already living in Chicago, already in graduate school, already building her own life. She knew I had done well in healthcare. I had told her that much. In the vague way parents sometimes protect their children from the weight of large numbers. She knew I consulted. She thought Lakeshore Capital Partners was a modest investment vehicle. She did not know it owned 11 hospitals. I had protected her from that knowledge the same way I had protected her from other things over the years, not out of deception, but out of the particular, exhausting love of a parent who has watched someone they cherish be hurt by the world and who will do whatever structural engineering is necessary to prevent it from happening again. The irony, of course, was sitting in a $4,000 suit at a restaurant I owned, explaining to me why my daughter should stop being her own person. Patricia's review took 3 weeks. What she uncovered in those 3 weeks I will not describe in full, because some of it is still part of an ongoing legal matter, and because some of it, the part about the personal expenses, made me angrier than I have been in a very long time, and I am a man who has made considerable effort over 63 years to keep his anger clean and purposeful. The short version is this. Over a period of 22 months, Derek Calloway had directed approximately $3.8 million through a network of vendor contracts, consulting agreements, and what were listed on the books as emergency capital reserves. The money had moved, in carefully structured increments, through Centrex Surgical Solutions and 2 other shell entities, and had ultimately landed in an account in Derek's name at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. He had been meticulous. He had been patient. He had used his position, his access, his authority over the approval processes, the particular trust that a CEO receives from a board that believes it hired someone exceptional as the mechanism. What he had not accounted for was that the man whose trust he was abusing happened to be the same man who drove an 11-year-old Buick to Sunday dinners and brought store-brand coffee cake. I called Patricia on a Thursday evening in January, and I told her to bring in outside forensic accountants and to loop in our outside counsel. I told her that I wanted everything documented, everything verified, and that nothing was to move until I said so. She asked me what I was planning. I told her I wasn't planning anything yet. I was watching. She said, "Gerald, how long have you known?" I said, 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Claire?" I said, "Not yet." That was the hardest part. Not the money I have made and lost enough money over the course of my life to understand that it is a tool, not a monument, and that tools can be replaced. The hardest part was the 12 weeks between when I knew and when I could act, during which I drove to Sunday dinners in my Buick, brought coffee cake, sat at the kitchen table my daughter had refinished herself, and watched Derek Calloway talk about his vision for the future with the comfortable authority of a man who believes the ground beneath him is solid. I watched him, and I kept my face very still, and I thought about Margaret. Margaret would have known what to do. She always did. She had a particular way of seeing through complicated situations to the thing that actually mattered, and the thing that actually mattered here was not the money and not even the betrayal. Not really. The thing that actually mattered was my daughter, who had called me at 6 in the morning crying and then pretended she hadn't. I thought about what Claire's life looked like from the inside, the quiet pressure to stop working, the lake house she hadn't seemed excited about, the way she had started calling me a little more often than usual. For no stated reason, just to talk. I thought about a woman slowly disappearing inside a life that had been designed to accommodate someone else. In March, Patricia came to me with a development I had not anticipated. One of the forensic accountants, a methodical man named Carl Strickland, had found a thread in the expense records that led somewhere new. Derek had been expensing personal charges aggressively, creatively, in ways that the expense review process had failed to flag because he was the person who had redesigned the expense review process 6 months after taking the CEO role. What Carl found, buried in 3 years of corporate card statements, were charges that included international travel for 2 destinations Derek had told Claire he visited alone for work, hotel suites. Jewelry purchases from a boutique in Paris, expensed as client gifts, in amounts and for items a woman's watch, a necklace, earrings that no reasonable person would call client gifts. I sat with that information for 2 days before I decided what to do with it. What I decided was this: Claire would not learn it from a document. She would not learn it from me, over the phone, while I tried to find words that do not exist for this particular kind of hurt. She would learn it the way it needed to be learned in full, in a setting where it could not be minimized or managed or explained away by a man in a $4,000 suit. Our annual board dinner was scheduled for April. It was a formal event, black tie, held at the Langham in downtown Chicago. The board, our senior leadership team, key institutional partners. Derek would be presenting the annual operational review. It was, as he had mentioned to me at dinner in December, basically a formality. I called Patricia in the first week of March and told her to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. I told her that we would be making a voluntary disclosure and providing full cooperation. I told her I wanted federal investigators brought in, and I wanted the timing coordinated with our board event in April. She said, "Gerald, you understand this will be very public." I said, "Yes." She said, "And Claire will be there." I said, "Yes. Please make sure she receives a formal invitation. I'll be seating her at the head table." There was a silence on the line that I understood. She said, "Are you sure about this?" I thought about the 6 a.m. phone call. I thought about a woman slowly disappearing. I thought about the watch in Paris and the necklace in the hotel suite. I said, "Patricia, I have been sure about very few things in my life. I am sure about this. I need to tell you about the night itself carefully, because it is the part people most want to know about and also the part I find most difficult to describe accurately. Not because it was chaotic, it was, in fact, very precise, but because the emotions of it do not arrange themselves into a neat sequence the way the events do. Claire arrived with Derek at 7:15. She was wearing a dark green dress that had been her mother's favorite color. She looked beautiful and slightly nervous in the way she always looked at formal events. And when she saw me across the lobby, her face did the thing it has done since she was small, a quick, private brightening, gone before anyone else could catch it. She crossed the lobby and hugged me and said, "Dad, you look nice," because I was wearing a tuxedo she had never seen before, and she seemed genuinely uncertain what to make of it. Derek shook my hand. He was, as ever, impeccably dressed. He told me I cleaned up well. He said it with the particular indulgence of a man performing generosity towards someone he believes needs it. We went into dinner. The evening progressed the way these evenings do, the particular formality of a large organized event, the movement of courses, the low hum of professional conversation. Claire was seated to my left. Derek was 3 seats down, at the center of the table, where a CEO belongs at his own company's dinner. At 9 o'clock, the board chair, a man named Robert Dunning, who has known me for 20 years, stood and gave the customary introduction for the operational presentation. Derek rose from his seat with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in these rooms. He walked to the podium. He straightened his notes. He said, "Good evening. It's an honor to stand before this group and share what has been, by any measure, an exceptional year for Marsh Medical Holdings." I watched my daughter's face. She was listening politely, the way you listen to a presentation by someone you know well enough that the content is less interesting than the performance of it. Derek spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He covered operational metrics, patient outcome improvements, expansion plans. He was, I will say again, very good at this. He had the particular gift of making complex information feel personally meaningful to whoever was listening. And then the doors at the back of the room opened. There were 4 of them, 2 federal agents and 2 members of our outside counsel who had been coordinating the process. They moved quietly, the way people move in rooms where they have legitimate authority and no need to demonstrate it. Robert Dunning stood again. He said, "I need to pause the proceedings for a moment." Derek turned from the podium. He looked at the 4 people who had entered. I watched the sequence move across his face, the irritation of an interruption, the confusion of not recognizing what was happening, and then something else, something I can only describe as the specific blankness of a man whose internal calculations have just returned an answer he cannot accept. Robert said, "Derek, federal investigators have been conducting a review of certain financial transactions within the company over the past several months. I need to ask you to step away from the podium." The room was very quiet. Derek said, "I'm sorry, what is this?" And then I stood up. I want to be honest with you about why I stood up at that moment. It was not theatrical. Or rather, it was not only theatrical. I stood up because Claire was sitting to my left, and I knew that in the next 60 seconds, her entire understanding of her life was going to shift, and I needed her to be able to look at me while that happened. I needed her to have somewhere to put her eyes that was solid. I said, "Derek, my name is Gerald Marsh. I am the founder and principal beneficiary of Lakeshore Capital Partners, which owns 83% of Marsh Medical Holdings. I have been the controlling stakeholder of this company for 26 years. I believe you have some things that belong to us, and I think it is time we got them back." The silence in that room was unlike any silence I have encountered in 63 years. It was the silence of a large group of people simultaneously revising a significant assumption. Derek looked at me. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that has stopped making sense. His mouth opened and then closed. He looked down at the table, then back at me. He looked at Claire. Claire was looking at me. Her face was doing something I had never seen it do before, a kind of rapid, layered recalculation, pulling in information from years of Sunday dinners and Buicks, and store-brand coffee cake, and 11 hospitals, and a 6 a.m. phone call, and a mother's favorite color, and trying to find a shape that held all of it at once. I looked at her. I said, quietly enough that it was only for her, "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across and put her hand over mine on the table. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The federal investigators asked Derek to accompany them. He did not make a scene I had half expected he might. Had prepared myself for it, but he didn't. He walked out of that room with the careful composure of a man trying to retain the last available form of dignity. The $4,000 suit looked, in that moment, like a costume someone had assembled in a hurry. The legal proceedings that followed took 14 months. Derek was indicted on 9 counts, including wire fraud and securities fraud. Thomas Brennan, the college roommate who had built Centrex Surgical Solutions on a timeline that conveniently matched Derek's arrival at the company, pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors. The $3.8 million was largely recovered. Derek received a sentence of 6 years. I am not going to tell you that watching a man who hurt my daughter walk out of a courtroom in handcuffs felt good. It felt like the end of something that should never have started. It felt like closing a door on a room you wish had never existed. What I am going to tell you is what happened in the weeks after the board dinner, because that is the part of this story that actually matters. Claire came to me 2 weeks after that night. She came to my house, the one with the oak tree in the yard, the one Margaret picked, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, the way she has done since she was a teenager. She sat there for a while without saying much. She had been through the initial shock, the attorneys, the particular administrative indignities of a life that has to be legally disentangled from another person's. She had been through the conversation about Paris and the watch in the hotel suite. She had been through more than I can describe in a way that would do justice to how much it cost her. She said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "About Derek or about the company?" She said, "Either, both." I thought about how to answer that honestly, because she deserved honesty, not the polished version. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what it means to love someone so much that you spend their whole childhood trying to build them a world where the ground doesn't move under them, and then they grow up and marry someone and the ground moves anyway, and there is nothing you built that protected them from the thing that actually got them. I said, I kept the company quiet because I didn't want it to be the reason people saw you a certain way. I didn't want anyone marrying you for what I had built. I wanted you to have your own life, your own work, your own reasons for being in a room. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And it happened anyway." I said, "Yes, I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be sorry about that, Dad. That's not your fault." We sat together in the kitchen for a long time after that, the way you sit with someone when you've run out of things to say that are more important than just being in the same room. Outside the window, the oak tree was beginning to come in, the first small leaves of April, the very beginning of green. I told her something that I want to tell you now, too. I told her that the thing I was most proud of in 63 years was not the 11 hospitals. It was not the trust structure or the capital appreciation or the board dinners at the Langham. It was that she had called me at 6 in the morning when something was wrong, even if she had hung up before she finished the sentence. It was that across a room full of people whose worlds were rearranging themselves around a piece of information they hadn't had 30 seconds earlier, she had put her hand over mine on the table without hesitating. That is what a man builds, if he is paying attention. Not companies, not portfolios, not the particular architecture of a secret kept long enough to matter. You build someone who knows where to put their hand when the ground moves. In the months that followed, Marsh Medical Holdings appointed an interim CEO from within the leadership team while a formal search was conducted. I became more visible in the organization than I had been in years, not as a daily operator, but as what I actually was: the founder, present, and accountable. Several employees who had worked at the company for decades and had never known my name came to me in those weeks with handshakes and, in 2 cases, with tears, which I was not expecting and which I received as best I could. Claire went back to her occupational therapy practice. She took on 2 new patients. She refinished another piece of furniture. She called me on Thursdays, and sometimes on other days too, for no particular reason, just to talk. I still drive the Buick. It has 12 years on it now, and the heater makes a sound it didn't used to make. And my mechanic, a man named Pete, who has been working on my cars for 18 years, tells me every time I bring it in that I could afford something newer. I tell him I know. He shakes his head and gets back under the hood. I stand sometimes in the parking lot of one of our hospitals, not the biggest one, the original one, the urgent care clinic on Western Avenue that is now a full-service community hospital with 412 beds. And I look at the building and I think about the second mortgage and the $32 work jacket and a man who stood outside a restaurant he owned in the same end. December wind off Lake Michigan, waiting to see what kind of man his daughter had married. I think about all the things I built that turned out not to be the most important ones. And then I get in the Buick and I drive home, and on the way I call my daughter, because I am 63 years old, and I have learned the hard way and the long way that the only thing worth protecting, in the end, is the people who put their hand over yours when the room goes quiet. That's all. That's the whole story.